Hello and a warm welcome to everyone here in the hall and online. I know many of you are logging in from different time zones. We are very happy to see you at the CEDCA panel discussion on the opposition and resistance to clean energy transition. I am Saifa Ayela. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Brighton, United Kingdom. I'm also a CEDCA IDS support team member, and I will be moderating the discussion. The Clean Energy for Development, a call to action, in short CEDCA, research initiative generates evidence to inform public policy reform and innovations in support of transformative clean energy transition where women and youth can play a key role in greening energy through micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Supported by the Canadian International Development Research Centre, IDRC, the CEDCA initiative brings together 12 projects from across 27 countries, aiming to support the knowledge ecosystem that can lead to more inclusive outcomes and efficient investments in sustainable energy transition in low-income countries. IDS partnered with IDRC to provide the 12 research projects with knowledge translation and communication support. Clean energy transition is not a new topic, but you may ask, why is there a renewed and growing interest in opposition to transition? I don't want to preempt the answer, but it has been a hot topic of late. In some countries, it may have even significantly influencing outcomes of competitive elections. Throughout the discussion, we will be focusing on the following questions. Number one, who are the opposition to clean energy and why do they oppose it? And number two, how can researchers and clean energy transition recognize the objections and position themselves to effectively engage with policymakers? With the while the opposition to clean energy transition is a global phenomenon, the discussion today focuses on low and middle income countries where CEDCA researchers work. Our primary objective is to support researchers, CEDCA researchers in particular, to better understand the pitfalls of clean energy transition, the drivers thereof, and strategize their approach to inform policy and practice. We are aware different audiences have interest in the discussion, and we are happy to see them joining the call. Welcome to all of you. We have prominent speakers lined up to discuss the main research questions, and there will be question and answer session as well. So the panelists, first, Professor Yacob Mulugetta. He's a professor of energy and development policy at the University College London. Yacob's current research focuses on energy systems and development, energy systems and climate change, and political economy and climate negotiations. Then we have further the other end, Dr. Shen. He's a research fellow at IDS. Wei has established research in low carbon and energy transition, particularly in China. And then we have Dr. Frangton Chiyemura, lecturer in international development at the Open University, UK. He has been conducting significant research on Chinese-financed renewable energy development initiatives in Africa. Then online, I have two discussants who I believe can relate the issues raised by the discussants, the panelists, to their own experience and the projects they work on. First, Ayesha Bery, who works on CEDCA project named Catalytic Climate Finance, a global learning hub. With colleagues, Ayesha develops new evidence on the implementation of effectiveness of blended finance solutions. Then we have Dr. Ferdinand Tonier, who is a research scientist at the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. He works on another CEDCA project named Innovate for Clean Powered Agro-Technologies, which aims to improve the productivity and income of rural smallholder farmers through low-cost energy-powered technology solutions. Finally, where are you, Mati? I have Madi here, who is a research officer at IDS. Madi is also a doctoral candidate at King's College London, focusing on the political economy and ecology of post-oil infrastructure in the Middle East. That's the lineup of speakers. And in terms of how I intend to run the discussion, after me, Madi will briefly present the rapid summary evidence on resistance to clean energy transition in low and middle income countries. And then we take around 1 hour conversation with the panelists and the discussants. That will be followed up by a question and answer session. And finally, a quick wrap up will follow. So that's the process I intend to take this conversation. Without any further ado, Madi, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Saif, for the introduction. Yeah, so we try. Right. So today I'll be speaking very briefly, very rapidly about some of the structural and overall patterns that govern resistance to clean energy projects across low and middle income countries. So I'm dividing my discussion to two overall arching concepts. The first is structural, which really looks at the global, international, difficult to change, more historical context in which clean energy transition occurs before discussing the more precise, concrete, local obstacles. So it's just a way of dividing. The themes, obviously both concepts feed into each other. And if you think about it, the structural will sort of appear as the more abstract conditions through which the obstacles manifest in local countries. So to start with the general structures that the rapid research used, effectively one of the most important obstacles to clean energy transitions has been the fact that clean energy projects are expensive. They require quite a lot of capital investments. These investments are currently estimated at a value of $1 trillion by the end of this decade by the International Energy Association. This $1 trillion is the lower scale estimation. Some other agencies such as McKinsey estimates this value at around 300 billion a year. So a lot over the 1 trillion mark. And at the same time, in addition to the high cost, the conditions of investments as they currently stand with regards to clean energy are mainly flowing to high income, already developed countries. This is the nature of capital investments in our world today. And it doesn't help because despite only 20% of these investments reaching low and middle income countries, low and middle income countries constitute 60% of people of the world. And so you can clearly see the disjuncture between needs and availability of funds. In addition to this very clear lack of funds and high cost, there's also the conditions that have governed the world today for the past decade or so. There's been one crisis after another that's been affecting countries' financial capacities. The COVID crisis has required spending across the board, but it's also led to an increase in interest rates in countries that lend. So the US and the UK, Europe, all these countries with excess capital that are able to lend to third world countries, low income and middle income countries, have had to raise their interest rates, which then leads to a increased cost for those lending, for those borrowing money. And that just increases the pressure effectively on state spending, which takes away from capacity to implement ambitious, large, long-term needed projects. And the last condition I wanted to speak about quickly is generally the way in which the current supply chains for renewable energy, for clean energy, as it exists now, most, although not all, most countries that are low and middle income countries tend to be commodities and resource exporters. So they're exporting the critical minerals and resources that are needed to build both electrification infrastructure and wind turbines and solar panels. All of these equipments that are needed to electrify societies and to implement clean energy projects, all of these are being built in high-income countries, but the resources for them are coming from lower and middle-income countries. And so the supply chain as it exists now means that certain countries have been able to develop their capacity to produce sophisticated equipment, but not really while other countries are stuck at the extractive phase. Of course, China and India are an exception to this general phenomena, and they're quite important exceptions because, as you may know, China's been able to really dominate critical minerals development and extraction and refining. And I'm slowly running out of time. So yes, generally these are the structural conditions which govern the more specific responses that we see on the ground to existing clean energy projects. So I wanted to divide the resistance into two things. The first is resistance from above. And you can think about this as resistance from the elites, from states, resistance from local governments and their implementation, what interests they have in maintaining fossil fuel use. Basically, fossil fuel use has already been mastered by various governments in low and middle income countries. They know how to extract rent through coal power plants and energy power plants that depend on fossil fuel. They have mastered this technology and how to extract rent from it. Solar panels, new cleaner energy, it's a new untested project, and it's a lot more difficult to arrange political power around it. And therefore, that creates some incentive for elites to perhaps not fully go and invest in clean energy. And the other kind of resistance is more from the people who are facing changes due to the implementation of clean energy projects. So if you think about a very prominent example is the farmers in the Western Ghats in India. There was a move to build huge wind turbines across a UNESCO heritage site in the Western Ghats, and the construction was leading to the demolition of various sites, but also the construction itself left construction rubbish and lots of destructive material in areas that were used to either water or feed the agricultural sector in that area. And so farmers and peasants were finding it difficult to accept this new reality. And you can see here, just from the small example, how people living in proximity to these projects might put up resistance. And I'm out of time. So yeah, this is a small overview, and not really sure what's going next, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Adi, thank you. So I'm coming to you, panelists. Mahdi's presentation obviously draws on academic and grey literature and touch on different forms of opposition, opposition to clean energy transition, including high initial cost of investment, right? So before we go into other sections of this conversation, would you like to first react to his presentation and maybe raise one or two issues around this opposition? It could be a theme, it could be an area. Just mention it without going into the details. I would like to start with you, Professor Yacob.
Thank you, Need to get wired up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Garo.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a lot I can add to what you've presented. That's really nice and comprehensive. I mean, I think when I look at what's happening today, I try to sort of also project backwards, let's say around 10, 12 years ago, when there was a serious kind of optimism around the possibility of moving towards renewables following the Copenhagen agreements. And of course, at the time, you also had a relatively benign or a friendly kind of leadership from the United States and among others. So that was an opportunity that I think is seriously missed. And I think the delay that was caused as a result of trying to make the market work as much as possible in the northern countries has actually created some of the reaction that we've seen certainly over the past few years. And I think even it's kind of fed into the whole kind of right-wing, call it narrative around politics, around green agenda, and so forth. So this pushback against so-called wokeism is where, in some ways, where we find some of our discussion around renewables. And I think that has to do with not being able to seize the moment in northern countries, which is worth thinking about in terms of moving into the future. That's something I would like to add. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Frangton.
Well, thank you, Seifi, and everyone, the panelists. So great to be here. I think I might want to pick up on what opposition or resistance to clean energy means.
We'll go to that. Just one or two thematic area of opposition, if you could raise.
Regarding this. Okay, all right, that's fine. I think maybe let's draw into kind of interest groups, particularly how this transition is likely to benefit others and also contribute to loss for some. And as we would know, for any development intervention, obviously there are winners and losers. But what's important is to understand what are the trade-offs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Great.
Thank you very much for inviting me. That's a wonderful presentation. You mentioned a lot about the actors that are resisting and the actions they're taking, in specific activities they're doing as a way to resisting or opposing. My question is, how can we conceptualize the ideas for these actors to do this resisting works? I think there are at least 3 types of ideas. Based on my observation in the past few years, one is that some believe that for low-income countries, it's not necessary to take on clean energy transition because their emission is low. Even if they reach net zero, they don't contribute that much to climate change. That's one way of kind of challenging the narratives. It's like it's not necessary. And the second type of narratives and ideas is like they're not ready. These developing countries, politically, they're too unstable, corruption and the governance system are fragile, not transparent. Politically, it's challenging. They're not ready. In terms of the market size is small. In terms of innovation, entrepreneurship, they're not there. So they're in terms of the market, they're not ready. In terms of technology, the transmission system is bad, and so on. So all this kind of aggregating to a kind of one idea, they're not ready to welcome energy transition. The third one is like the pain is too big and the cost is not distributed unevenly.
Okay.
So these type of 3 ideas are actually driving all the activities you mentioned.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Frangton, I kind of interrupted you, but I will come to you now. So at this stage, we need to establish conceptual clarity. So in your understanding, what do you mean by opposition? What do you mean by resistance to clean energy transition? To you, what are the nature, forms, or manifestations of opposition and resistance?
Well, thanks, Seife. I think let me just make this clear that probably my discussion today will likely draw from my experiences of doing research in Eastern and Southern Africa, particularly looking at Chinese-backed wind and solar energy projects. And the second thing also I'd really like to make a clarification is my experiences are basically on large-scale utility-fed renewable energy, not probably small-scale rooftop, if you want, solar rooftops. And thirdly, I think it's important that we make this clarification, particularly around the word clean itself, knowing how contested it is. So allow me today to interchangeably use the word clean and renewable energy. I understand that at the edge we are in clean and renewable energy are now conceptually different. So I would appreciate that you consider this as a deliberate oversimplification. In thinking about what does opposition and resistance to clean energy transition mean to me, there are several things that we can really think about, but I think some of those probably will be addressed by the panelists here. One thing I want to mention is about resistance and opposition to what I refer to as project delivery processes. Some would kind of consider this as governance processes around how these projects are delivered. So what this means is that people or whoever is involved in these projects are not basically resisting or opposing this project for the sake of resistance, but they are somehow not happy or comfortable about how these projects are actually implemented. So I think the critical point for me to consider here in thinking about opposition is about what are the governance processes involved in delivering these projects. And because of these kind of oppositions to how these projects are delivered, there are several issues that we have to consider. And one of them really is thinking about what are the economic and social issues involved such that people end up kind of resisting or opposing these projects. All right. Obviously, we know that the trade-offs may sometimes involve insufficient knowledge sharing and transparency, particularly around the impact or the benefits of these projects. Who stands to get a benefit? Who is losing from that? Again, how are the risks distributed? Who is going to lose from that, so to speak? But then there are also concerns, particularly around the community where these projects are sited. Who is going to benefit from this? How are these projects going to affect land use change within these given areas? And if there's no clear information about how these projects are going to benefit them, chances are these communities or these places or people within these regions where these projects are sited are going to resist. But increasingly, there are also technical issues that I think are coming out these days. So for instance, we've heard about issues of how some of the grids are not modernized to such an extent that they are not able to integrate this so-called intermittent energy coming particularly from these renewable energy sources. So how then do we create some systems that are able to modernize some of these grids? So likely you're going to get a bit of resistance from the utilities or the energy distributors companies saying they are not in a position to integrate these renewables into their grid system. And then finally, maybe I think it's important also to consider aspects broadly around planning. It involves issues around permits, environmental laws, regulations, and bylaws, who is involved in that process. If there is no kind of transparency around the processes, chances are people or whoever is involved is likely to resist or reject these projects. So I think what is important, or the point I'm driving home here is, it's not just opposition or resistance for the sake of it, but resisting the project delivery mechanisms.
Thank you very much. And Wei, you've started answering the question I asked. So I'll ask you the same question. To you, what are the nature, forms, levels and manifestations of opposition and resistance? How do you understand it? Following what Frangton has said.
Just very briefly, I think, that's a very good generalization of different types of resistance from different type of actors. But again, I would like to conceptualize a little bit to say, okay, can we differentiate those resistance that are not actually against the clean transitions per se, but it's against a kind of existing system that people, for example, resisting a wind farm, a solar park, just as they resisting a large dam. or a large fossil fuel infrastructures, because there's a kind of a conflicts between these large infrastructures with local community interest and benefits and so on. So all these type of resistance have been there for many decades. So how can we understand this as a kind of a old wine in a new bottle, this type of thing? And there's a new resistance as well, for example, from the utility companies, which is really a new challenge that they have to accommodate intermittent powers and so on. So we need new policy instruments. So we have to differentiate really old resistance and new resistance in the context of clean energy transition. And second is that we also have to differentiate what is the total resistance or kind of a partial resistance. In total resistance, it's like they reject the idea of energy transition at all. They challenge the fundamental rationales for clean energy transition. But I think that kind of a resistance is really becoming less and less popular. More often we see more or less like a partial resistance. They challenge the processes of it. They question the trade-offs of it. They question the pace and the sequence of the energy transition. And those problems could be context specific, where different types of country may face different types of resistance at different times. And as researchers, we have to review the complexity of the resistance accordingly.
Thank you very much, Wei. Yacob, the question is the same, and if you would like to add to what the gentleman said, please.
Well, I think, I mean, I did my PhD and master's on renewable energy. And that's going back to the late 80s and early 90s. And part of the reason why I did that was it had nothing to do with the climate, because that agenda was not even on the table. It was purely about energy access and energy services in the Horn of Africa. That's what triggered me to come into this field. So on the question of opposition and resistance, there's always been opposition and resistance towards renewables. It's just that, it's a different type of resistance that we are seeing. In the past, the resistance was, well, these technologies are not quite ready. They're intermittent. There are all sorts of technical issues. They're expensive, etc. At the moment, and then, we moved beyond 2010 when the cost of the price of renewables plummeted, largely because of China, thanks to China. That's where, the kind of the renewable energy manufacturing is happening. And therefore the prices, came, crashing down. But suddenly now the resistance that we're facing is a different type of resistance. And this one is, something which is very much connected to the whole question of the cost of capital. So on the one hand, you have countries in the global north that are able to access cheap finance, or at least until recently. Yeah, we've had a decade of nearly zero interest rate, and they have been able to benefit as a result of that. Now, you look at countries such as Ethiopia or Kenya or Zimbabwe, they can't access that money. They have to be subjected to a different type of a litmus test, as it were, that they need to be, risk, all their risk profiles need to, it's just not compatible with the type of investment that renewable energy systems call for. Partly because, renewable energy is expensive when it comes to the cost of, the initial cost. So you have to raise a lot of capital to be able to do that. And the private sector is not going to do that in Africa. We've been talking about de-risking and blended finance, all that stuff for the past 15 years. We're talking about what, 2% of investment is actually happening in some of these countries. So I think, the resistance that we are seeing is different. The type of resistance we are seeing towards renewables in the north is completely different, to what we are seeing in other parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Yacob. So what I'm hearing is there are different forms and levels of opposition. Maybe we didn't exactly mention it, but people may oppose to pylons or infrastructure, or some even, as Wei was saying, the cost of it both, all the panelists mentioned that. So there are different types of opposition, different levels at the community, country level, even global level. So thank you all for clarifying that, for your contributions on that. Now, I would like us to unpack all these, I mean, the core areas that you mentioned. One of it was that what you said, Frangton, is to do with the losers from this activity. So let's look into that. We have phasing out industries, if you like, oil and gas or coal industry are the ones losing out as business and people working in those entities as well. So, Frangton, to you, what are the issues here? Who are the opposition? How do they mount opposition? And what can be done about it? Take your time, and maybe you want to go to the podium and reply to this. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks once again, Seife, for this opportunity to share my kind of experiences of researching, particularly Chinese-backed renewable energy projects in Africa. So you've asked me to look particularly on theme 2, which is on the effect of clean energy transition on those phasing out industries. So I think in the next maybe 9 or 10 minutes,
yes,
I will specifically focus on this and responding to the question of what the issues are, who is opposing the energy transition, how they mount these forms of oppositions or resistance, and then what needs to be done to address this resistance. So, but before I do that, probably I want to give you a bit of context here, which is always important. For those probably who have been following developments in Nigeria, you know that I think in 2016, they announced that they were going to deliver 14 projects on PPAs in the solar energy sector. As we're speaking now, those projects have not materialized. For those following developments in Zimbabwe, you realize that I think the government by then committed to develop about 2,000 megawatts from solar projects, and there were a couple of cancellations of this declaration, particularly citing issues to do with policy changes and uncertainties regarding this project delivery mechanism. And for those who follow developments in South Africa, particularly for bid window 5 of 2021, you'd realize that out of the 25 projects that were awarded at bidding window 5, nearly half of those projects have failed as we are speaking now. In Ethiopia, which probably might be of interest to some of the colleagues around here, 2 of the 5 PA projects, which were signed by the government, looking at the solar sector, have unfortunately been cancelled as well. The list can go on. I can reference many other places where at least some of these renewable energy projects have been cancelled. And one might wonder then, what are the issues? Why are these projects being cancelled? I think it is important that we identify that these issues manifest at different levels. And they tend to vary, particularly with different governance systems within these different African or low middle-income countries. I would like to pick up on the point which Matt raised earlier on, which is basically around initial investment cost. And this again has also been cited as one of the reasons why some of these projects actually have been cancelled. They argue that renewable energy projects require large upfront investments, and some of these countries, they do not have that finance. I think for those, for instance, who have been following developments in Ethiopia, you'd realize that over the past maybe 15 or 16 years, some of these renewable energy projects that have been developed there have largely been debt financed, which meant that the Ethiopian government would borrow money, particularly from China in this case, to develop these projects, mainly under these EPC plus financing arrangements, right? But now the government is at a stage where they can't continuously borrow money to build these projects, which means we have to think about other mechanisms of delivering these projects. But there is also this old argument that in most cases you tend to hear from those people who back these fossil fuels, that fossil fuels projects are cheaper than renewable energy, right? But of course they do kind of forget the social costs of those fossil fuels. So all these reasons then looking at these economic factors really would contribute to people saying, I think it's not really in our best interest to develop these projects. If you are more or less interested in these aspects of around initial investment costs, there are notable cases, for example, from the Kenya's Lake Turkana, which took a bit of some time, particularly from 2014 to 2017, where there were kind of delays. And the main reason for that was due to financing that big project. Similar cases are also notable in Ghana during the Nzema Solar Park project, again, which took a bit of some time until the project came to a financial close. But beyond these investment costs, there are also issues to do with economic interest and also kind of tied broadly to ideology around the right to development, if you want. We all know, for instance, South Africa, Nigeria, Angola, Libya, they have massive deposits of, for instance, coal in the case of South Africa, oil in the case of Libya and Angola. And for them, it's probably more easier to develop these projects than actually going into renewable energy. So why, out of interest, will they focus on developing renewables when they have these massive natural resources that they can use actually to fund their energy projects? So which means that you are likely to face a bit of resistance, particularly from these countries, because they would, in most cases, if you check again, their exports actually coming from these natural resources, where you're looking at 50, 60% of the export earnings coming from this. So how then would you promote that these countries then need to kind of diversify and move into renewables? I think I can go on to explain some of these economic interests, but let me also move into kind of more technical aspects, which in most cases tend to look at, for instance, grid infrastructure limitations, which I said earlier on. This idea of how then do we integrate renewables into our old, some would say, unmodernized grid systems, right? We all have this argument saying, oh, well, we can't really be buying, or we can't be really committing much to storage at the moment when we actually don't have the energy in the first place. So this means that they're likely to say, let's go for the renewables. But then how do you manage intermittence in this case? Again, this is one of the issues then you would likely to see people opposing or rejecting these renewable energies. Some of these really also are, maybe if you look at issues to do with land rights and land use change as well, which tend to really focus into the communities. For instance, rejecting because they say it's going to affect their sources of livelihood. But it's not always the case, particularly for wind, where you know at least there's initial disturbance, particularly for the period of construction. Then after that, probably farmers can go back to their land. And then the beast or the elephant in the room, political factors as well. And we understand that sometimes issues to do with lobbying, for those probably studying South Africa, you'd understand this better. Now, various political institutions have actually been kind of resisting or pushing back the transition to renewables, particularly because it affects their economic means. But also, you have instances in Nigerian oil companies actually pushing back against this transition to renewables. And the list can go on and on and on. Let me move to the second aspect of this in terms of who is opposing these transitions to renewable energy. I think if you're following me, you kind of started picking up that some of these actors, who they are. So in this case, for instance, you know the fossil fuel industry and how actually it is their bread and butter. So if you want to really take that away from them, what are the implications of that? So chances are you really indeed face a lot of resistance from this. But we also have some utility companies, not all of them, some, who have massively invested in this kind of fossil fuel-based energy system. You know, ESCOM at the moment in South Africa, you know how much they've been pushing back this independent renewable energy procurement program, you know. And then we can also have some social movements, probably at the community level, kind of opposing, not necessarily opposing the project themselves, but opposing the way the projects are actually implemented. So if you want, picking up on what Wei was saying, this is more of like partial resistance to the projects. How do they do this? Well, if there are social movements, the expectation is that probably it's all about organizing communities. And I'd like to kind of share a short story, particularly of my experiences of researching some of the Chinese projects in Ethiopia, where the communities, for instance, as simple as just blocking the construction site, as a way of demonstrating that we are not happy about how we are doing this. as simple as it may be, but it managed to delay the project for about 3 to 4 months with implication on cost, both to the project delivery and also to the government. But also sometimes, particularly in more advanced and developed countries, you would see this idea of legal challenges being mounted against some of these projects, and kind of draws from this idea of not in my background, this NIMBYism element, that really I want to see my view when I open the window on my balcony, I don't want to see this bed and stuff like that. And some even can actually mount some legal challenges, say you're actually aesthetically disturbing my peace and tranquility, so to speak. And then for those probably following trends in America at the moment, you would also realize that even some think tanks, actually, they are being increasingly funded to kind of push back by providing some information, some false information, if you want, saying that fossil fuels are actually better for the environment than it were for the renewables. They'll start playing around these statistics. So how does it take? How much pollution does it take to produce a turbine? Or all this stuff, they'll start throwing numbers around that. And if you're not careful, you end up kind of being swayed to that. There was an element you asked me to look at as well on what needs to be done. I think what needs to be done then has to be contextual. There is no kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to this. We have seen, for instance, in South Africa, they've tried with their independent renewable energy procurement program. Of course, it has its own challenges, but to some extent, it is working, all right? So it's all about thinking about locally relevant, context-specific project delivery mechanisms. That probably, if you want, like what Yacob was saying, thinking about this idea of blended finance, de-risking, who takes the risk, and how are these risks and benefits distributed, and also probably thinking about more involvement of the communities, because at the end of the day, it's where the project is sited. All right. So I think in kind of conclusion, I think we all agree here that renewable energies actually hold the promise for developing Africa, particularly because this is where I've been doing my research in. But I think successful implementation of this project requires addressing fundamental challenges, which I've mentioned above, and also requires a bit of coordination from the government, the investors, development partners, and the communities where these projects are sited. I'll end here.
Thank you very much, Frangton, on time as well. Could you, Yacob, just add, take a minute or two to add to what Frangton said, please?
I mean, I think Frangton said it all, but and that there are some context-specific type of challenges that are inherent in countries that push back against renewables. I mean, yes, we've been following the Ethiopian case for quite some time, and it is a classic example of where a country may have some bold ideas, but the way in which it's going to raise finances is the real challenge that it faces. But also, I mean, Ethiopia's case also didn't really. There wasn't, a kind of a process of, socialization, or if you want, building political consensus, partly because, the country itself was single party country, and, there wasn't, democratic institutions where you could actually have those conversations. So let me just point to an interesting example, which may give us some clues. I mean, I don't know if anyone has followed the case of Uruguay. Uruguay in around 2004, 5, 2006 faced, a major crisis. At the time, they were so dependent on thermal power, most of which the fossil fuel would be imported. And so the then government brought in some researchers to actually go and actually think, we are in a crisis. What do we do? Yeah. And so this group came together and began to work on the possibility of moving away from fossil fuels, because they saw fossil fuels, the way in which, it was eating up all their money as a way to phase it out, at least, partially. And they came up with their own program, using their own data, their own analytical tools. They developed them themselves. They didn't go to McKinsey and ask for a modeling tool from them, or invite McKinsey to do it for them. So this was a moment where the local sort of agency of the country, the knowledge agency, was mobilized to be able to come up with the kind of the pathway for Uruguay. And then immediately after that, you had a change of government. This was the government of Mokiko that came to power. You remember, this man, who was president for quite some time, I don't know, 5-6 years or so. This is a man, who spent 12 years in solitary confinement and had very different ideas, was actually pushing, a lot on the green, as well as, the whole question of equity within politics and so forth. So he was coming, from the left side of the politics. So when they approached him, what he said to them was absolutely critical. He said, look, I'm for it. I like, what you guys have done here, but we're going to have to sell it to all others, because we're not going to be in power forever. This is a national agenda that needs to have a much deeper buy-in by all the political actors. So they spent a year selling this idea, going from one political agency party to another, and managed, to build a kind of consensus that allowed Uruguay to be able to invest. I mean, today, Uruguay's electricity is something like, 90-95% renewables, both hydro and lots of wind. But they were also able to build, local capacity, local institutions, and, all the capability locally was beginning to be mobilized. So there were other co-benefits that they were getting out of that. And the private sector that came was not, coming on its own terms only. It was on the country's terms as well. So there was a real negotiation that was happening. So I think, this is maybe a good example.
Thank you very much. Wei, maybe 30 seconds, maximum a minute to.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Yes.
Just throw away all the things I would like to say. Just follow this. Coordination is the key. And because, previously I talked about the ideas that the developing countries are not ready to welcome clean energy transition. Is one of the arguments is that they're not efficient, they're not coordinated. But these things can be done as this wonderful example. I think another message is that, okay, we need to situate in clean energy transition with a broader picture of sectoral reforms. When we consider the majority in most of African countries where the whole system is run by a monopoly utility, and without proper reform to introduce some kind of competitive mechanisms within these markets, clean energy transitions will not go very far. But the current solution is more or less like one size fits all, this kind of solution. Let's introduce IPPs into it. Let's introduce foreign investors into the market so that they can compete with the state utility companies. Things will be resolved. Things will not be resolved. As we see in many countries, in Ethiopia, for example, the state utilities say, okay, if it is a government-to-government project, it can be done. We have done Ayesha, we have done Amada in a kind of 12 months time frame. When we talked about IPP, it took us 2 or 3 years to even get financial closure. So it's not like, IPP is like silver bullets in the corners of Africa, but at the same time, we need to think about how to enhance the competitiveness of the electricity market, given that most of them are run by a monopoly utility. So these are combined questions that, can't be resolved by just simply think, okay, let's do a renewable IPP, things will be resolved.
Thank you very much, Wei and Frangton, for leading on this theme, and Yacob as well for your contribution. Now, Wei, you have been alluding to this for some time now. Another big challenge is generating investment for clean energy development, which can be captured by a phrase like increasing an uneven burden of cost of investment in clean energy. This is a challenge area where there seems to be opposition or resistance, if you like. Could you take, say, up to 10 minutes and explain what this problem is about, where, in terms of region or countries, the opposition is, the opposition to heavy price of clean energy transition is most felt, right? And how can green finance can be instrumental and fairly invested where it is most needed? Please. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I have to use the slide. Safety suggests me not to, but there are one or two slides that are too good to be missed. I'm sorry. I think we have mentioned that for some countries, the investors are just reluctant to go there, and particularly in the majority of the African countries. We see a reality that just like Yacob mentioned, that less than 2% of the total investment on renewables in the last decade actually went to Africa. But if you think about specific investments, the majority of them went to large economies on the continent like South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and so on. So if you think about the low-income countries, low-income African, sub-Saharan African countries, altogether 37 received 0.4% of total investments in the past decade. That's the scenario we're facing. But we're asking questions why they don't want to invest in Africa. I think the right question is why they would prefer investing somewhere else. Okay, so that's why I use. That's why I have to use slides. This one case I just emerged when I do research last year. The pop-up when I tried to examine the Chinese investment in the Middle East, and this project popped up is in Abu Dhabi. All right, and this single project is about 2 gigawatts of solar park. This more or less the largest solar park on Earth. And if you think about the way they're doing this investment, it's like 30-year PPA. with the lowest tariff of 1.3 cents. Ridiculously low price. If you think about the tariff on the African continent, is at least 3 or 4 cents, right? And it's a government procurement. And if you think about the investors, it's a combination of 2 very powerful local energy companies, Master and TACA, and 1 Chinese company, a solar company providing high quality panels, together with EDF, the French company providing expertise on project management. If you think about financiers, again, a combination of banks from France, BNP, from Japan. There are 3 Japanese banks in there. There are Bank of China in there, and there's a local bank. The consortium is very strong, right? And to finance about $1 billion. So think about altogether, the sub-Saharan African countries last year had a 1.3 gigawatts new additional renewables, and this one single project is about 2 gigawatts. And okay, that's not, I think about the efficiency of those banks and investors by signing the PPA. After 5 months, they got financial closure. 5 months. And when Frangton introduced that, how many years that many of the African countries struggling for 200 megawatts of solar park, or even fewer. That's the contrast of how efficient those financiers can be when they see this is a good project. And this is not even the craziest part. If you think, and these banks are actually breaking most of the protocols, most of the norms about project financing. First, they provide 100% equity and debt financing. They, normally the bankers who finance the equity don't want to finance the debt because they want to share the risks with other financial institutions. And normally they would like to urge the project developers, the investors to pay at least 15% of the equity. But in this case, they cover 100% with such low interest rate. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the interest rate. It's LIBOR plus 80 basis points. Again, ridiculously low. And if you think about the maturity of the loans, you think the PPA is about 30 years, right? The maturity of the loans is only 4 years, which means that they ask the investors to repay everything, interest and the principal in one go after 4 years, when the projects just get operationalized, which means that they know that at that time, there's no cash flow sufficient generated from the project to repay loans, but they still give us such a short time. And that's why they can put interest rates in such a low rate of 80 basis points. On what ground? You have a 30 years PPA, but you have a 4 years loan asking the investors to get all the money back in 4 years' time. That doesn't make any sense, but the reality is that they would like to securitize all the project assets in the secondary market, using green bonds, using derivatives to get finance repaid after 4 years' time. So after 4 years' time, all these banks already got their money and exit the projects. That's how the games are played in the project side that they think is profitable for them. Okay, the effect of this is like the following. The conventional loans, like that period when the bankers just lending on renewable projects, waiting for 20 or 30 years to get a loan payment back, that age is increasingly, less appealing for the commercial banks. It's a securitization, derivatives, using bonds, using climate finance, using all these type of innovative instruments to get money back as quick as possible. Talking about long-term vision, but doing short-term investment, that's become a trend. Those countries, those markets without access to these capital markets will be left behind. Because obviously, as a bank, if you have this model available, I will not think about a 20-year-old, 30-year-old loan anymore, right? And of course, then if you have a model like this, everybody will be focusing on the markets with access of this type of instruments, and other markets will be left behind. And think about it, if you can exit in 4 years' time, would you be interested about the long-term sustainability of the local communities, development benefits, social relations with the communities, and so on? No, you don't think about those because you're thinking about exiting 4 years' time. Right, so as long as the ESG forms can be checked, can be ticked, you just submit the form and get the financing. Those are the games we're playing at the moment. I think that's the scenario. So another question is, can public finance address these issues? We assume, as Yacob already critical about this, it's like we assume that the public finance can mobilize private finance into more difficult markets. It's not happening. We're assuming that we're using the tail wagging the dog. No, actually, they are doing opposite. If you think about where the public finance go, this is the JEP, the most kind of largest financial schemes. If you think about the contracts that is in they do in South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam, those are not markets that need finance. Of course, they need finance, but those are already the markets with sufficient private finance. And if you think about the Chinese financing, of course, you may assume that the Chinese will do more risky loans. But now, if you think about Sinoshka, who is the eventual, export credit agency who take the risks for the Chinese lending, these are, again, the countries that they're focusing, upper middle income countries, not focusing on low income countries. So that's the reality we're facing. What are the solutions? I don't have any, but I think the picture already shows that there are some fundamental flaws of the configuration between public and private finance, and why the logic is, what's the logic behind capital markets in focusing on markets like Middle East and Europe and so on, but not sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you very much, Wei. Thank you. Ayesha Bery online, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ayesha, for joining us. You have been looking at different ways of financing clean energy projects as part of the CEDCA projects. And could you please reflect on what Wei said, and maybe with an example, tell us a little bit about how green finance or blended finance can be instrumental in this situation?
Yes, thanks. And very interesting discussion. Really appreciate the points that all the panelists have made. So yeah, my name is Ayesha Bery. I'm a manager at Convergence, and our entire focus is on increasing private investments into developing countries using blended finance. So I've heard blended finance come up a couple times, and sort of the potential it provides, but also some of the challenges as well. So just a quick background for those in the audience who might not be too familiar with what blended finance is. Blended finance is a structuring approach and a financial structuring approach that's meant to adjust the risk-return ratio of investments by reducing risks and also increasing the returns potential of investments by using concessional capital. So this is public or philanthropic funding, mostly aid funding in a more strategic way. So the rationale for blended finance really came up with the launch of the SDGs and recognizing the financing gap that exists for achieving sustainable development and the current sources really being insufficient. So relying on traditional sources of aid, public funding, really not sufficient to meet the scale of the challenge, but also recognizing the large apprehension that exists from the private sector when increasing their appetite for investments into developing countries, noting how conservative a lot of these investors are. So what Convergence does is provides a lot of data research as well as matchmaking support to try to reduce the fragmentation in the blended finance market, but also provide more evidence on the investment financial performance and returns from blended finance. What are the best structures? What offer pathways to scale? So I thought I could just provide a little bit of background on some of the research we've done on blended finance trends and then offer some good examples of where we've seen good traction. So, we recognize that there's obviously a huge financing gap in investment costs when it comes to transitioning energy within developing countries. So we do see blended finance. What we do is we track the entire blended finance market, and we look at what sectors has blended finance so far been most active in. So energy is without a doubt the largest source, the largest focus of the blended finance market. So more than half of all transactions that are entering the blended finance market are focused on renewable energy. A lot of this is large-scale project finance, so around 75% of those transactions, and then a smaller percentage are in off-grid transport and sort of carbon credits. I do want to acknowledge that a remaining challenge within the blended finance market that's sort of been touched on already is that the focus often is on sort of lower middle income countries. So those are some of the countries highlighted, including Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa. But a smaller portion is going towards low income countries and least developed countries. So the LDCs receive under 25% of all investments, and this is due to the perceived risk profile for many private investors. We are seeing some modest financing increases, and I think that, recognizing the scale of the challenge, having 25% of the market focus on low income and LDCs is not relative to overall financial flows, is actually relatively good. It's quite overrepresented when looking at it through blended finance versus overall the financial markets. And then another challenge continues to be, how do we increase the amount of investment that are coming from local and regional investors? Because the majority of blended finance is looking at currently targeting global investment. So another challenge that we note is, how can we increase local investment from local financial institutions and local other types of institutional investors who might not see the business case for investing in climate, don't have net zero targets that some of the global financial institutions have, and also don't find that the blended finance structures meet their investment expectations. They aren't in local currency. They might not be familiar structures. So those are some of the challenges that we sort of reconcile, recognizing that so far blended finance has demonstrated a lot of traction in renewable energy in particular, but how do we increase the participation of local investment and domestic sources of capital, and also how do we increase the amount of financing that's going towards low-income countries and least developed countries? So one issue in particular that we've been reflecting on as with support of IDRC and in the CEDCA cohort is also this question of a just transition, reaching marginal groups, and particularly gender equity. So actually the first report that we've done with support of CEDCA and IDRC is looking at how to also increase sort of the gender representation within energy, which is not a sector that often has demonstrated a high level of gender equity or gender responsiveness. So recognizing that as we're having this transition conversation about how to increase financing flows, restructure sort of the energy economy, how can we also make it more just and also increase the idea of a gender lens? So we did a stock taking report where we looked at the climate finance market and looked at what percentage of transactions are gender responsive. If you look at the entire market, you'd find that only 2% really think about gender within their value chain. So that could be within the labor force, leadership, and beneficiaries. Now, when you look at it through blended finance, so this is when you introduce funding that's coming from the development community, multilateral development banks, public sources, that statistic increases, but it's still only about 20% of all blended finance transactions within energy that within climate that have a gender lens, and it's less likely to be in energy than other sectors like agriculture and health and education. So a lot of what our research has been on is how can we also use blended finance within energy to also make sure that it's looking at more marginal groups, and particularly looking at ideas like gender equity and increasing women within energy construction, within the labor force, within the beneficiaries, and within senior leadership. So I won't spend too much time going through the report findings, but we've looked at how concessional capital and public sources of capital can help increase this gender equity lens. So things like providing early stage support to energy developers, project sponsors, and fund managers to start thinking about gender within their KPIs, thinking about monitoring and evaluation and data collection frameworks. So how can that capital been used up front to help project be thinking about more marginal groups and gender in particular? Tools like technical assistance to look at a little bit more complex issues. So for example, we looked at the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB Invest, the DFI, and how they're being innovative with their use of technical assistance to ensure that when they're supporting project developers, that they're looking at bringing in a gender lens, for example, within actual construction and the labor force, which can be very difficult for project developers who wouldn't even think of how something like bringing gender equity is relevant to their project. And also things like performance-based incentives. So using financial tools where you'll provide a reduction rate in the interest rate of a loan if certain targets are met. So this could apply to gender targets. It could apply to other marginalized groups. But we've seen a lot of success with these types of concessional tools. So I think the overarching focus of what we're looking at is, as we think about using blended finance to reduce some of the investment risk and financial risk that's being demonstrated at present, how can we also use it to also make sure that that transition is just and that factors like gender equity and other marginalized groups are also being brought into the equation. So I would say that overall, energy has shown a lot of traction within blended finance. There's still a lot of issues when it comes to increasing local representation of investors and also reaching some of these target markets that are harder in LDCs. But it's certainly an area that's had a lot of interest within the blended finance market.
Thank you very much, Ayesha. Thank you. Thank you. Way for leading this conversation as well. Now, the last theme, the clean energy supply chain has not been that clean, has it? Yacob, maybe if you could say a little bit on environmental and livelihood related concern associated with the clean energy supply chain. We can talk a lot about it, I know, but
I'll be very brief, yeah. Well, thank you again for this invitation, and yeah, happy to be here. One of my favorite places to be in terms of, you know, the scholarly space that is IDS. I mean, I think, you know, maybe why are we even talking about this should spring up, you know, some questions. I mean, the whole agenda around global decarbonization needs to happen if we really believe in what the IPCC is saying. And a close-up inspection of what the data shows, if anything, it's a very conservative target that the IPCC has set, for example. that we're talking about, you know, the 1.5 degrees needs to be achieved very soon, but we are already something like, you know, 80 to 90% of the emissions, the budget has already been spent. Yeah. And this is, in fact, you know, if you look at even the IPCC scenarios, within the scenarios, you have most of the scenarios actually include carbon dioxide removal and so forth. If you were to take that out, you could argue that, you know, we will exceed the 1.5 very shortly. That's the reality we're in. What the implications, of course, we all know what the implications are. So the climate, you know, climate change has major implications for the countries that we are all concerned about. So as a system itself, there is already a kind of an injustice that's inscribed into that, into the climate and the energy discussion already. But let me just, you know, very quickly talk about the upstream. And here we're specifically talking about renewable energy, the upstream part of it. But before that, I mean, we're talking about, you know, 50% of cobalt is located in DRC. Something like, you know, 40% of manganese in South Africa and Gabon. Quite large quantities of graphite between Mozambique and so the story is that the kind of for the global decarbonization, the minerals are going to, you know, come from the global south by and large. Yeah. And we're talking about Africa, which is just a newcomer into that picture, but eventually it will become even bigger. But we're talking also about South America and to some extent, some of the Pacific regions as well. So then, you know, what we are looking at is a move from a kind of a carbon intensive type of, you know, energy towards something which is much more industry intensive or minerals intensive. And this changes, you know, the whole picture altogether. So today's, you know, fossil based, you know, countries may not be the countries that will pick up on the opportunities coming out from from a new minerals-based type of future. Some may be. If you look at, for instance, I saw Saudi Arabia's data not long ago, and they've got everything. All the minerals that you can think about, they've got it. Yeah, in large and huge quantities and untapped. But they also have money to be able to develop that into some. I think maybe you would be able to tell us more. So, so we are in this kind of complex system where solving the climate challenge will potentially also can create localized environmental problems. So whatever happens, because when we're talking about mining, we're talking about large-scale operations. Just to take a little piece of mineral out of the ore, we're talking about mining, you know, changing the landscape in a serious kind of way. Yeah, we see that, you know, in pictures from DRC and elsewhere. We see that from the copper mines in Chile, what it can do. But we're also talking about needing much more minerals of different types that will be needed for the transition, the global transition. Now, when you look at a lot of the sources are coming from the global south, but the processing itself doesn't happen there. A lot of the processing, the large majority, 80–90% of the processing actually happens in China. Yeah, and China is also, you know, it holds 60% of the rare minerals. So in essence, I mean, you know, what we're looking at is a concentration of renewable energy power that is that China has. And the reason for that is because, you know, it's a country that has managed, that has understood the future, and it has invested into the long-term future of renewables. They've realized early on, this is a potentially strategic area, and therefore we need to secure resources. And they have managed, you know, to be able to do that. Unlike, you know, what's happening now with the global north, the northern countries are scrambling about trying to look for new opportunities and so forth. So I think, you know, the cost for local communities in terms of environment and so forth is quite staggering, but the benefits are actually not there yet. The other area is also to look at the downstream. when we look at downstream, for instance, countries are, we've talked about, a lot of the kind of the market questions. Yeah. So renewable energy comes with its own challenges. And here we're talking about once you've manufactured renewable energies and you're trying to generate power out of that. You go to anywhere, Spain, Germany, and then further into the global south, the cost of renewables on land resources, on water resources is quite staggering. So it goes beyond just the point at which extraction happens, but also in generation, the same thing. And then also at the consumption end, that's the other aspect also that's quite often that's overlooked. And here you could argue that the 1% richest in the world are responsible for, 20% of emissions, the 10% responsible for 60 odd percent of emissions. So when we talk about climate change and the need to push renewables purely on the basis of climate change, it doesn't make any sense at all. So I think when we talk about environmental and social impact, we do need to look at the upstream, the downstream, but also at the consumption point. And there, what we see is almost like an envelope of injustice that's very much inscribed into the energy system.
Thank you so much, Yacob. Thank you. Ferdinand online, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, could you please reflect on what Yacob said and say a little bit more about, from your own experience, CEDCA project experience, on the pressing issues around environmental and livelihood concerns related to clean energy, please.
All right, so thank you very much. I would want to say that a lot have been touched on in terms of issues globally on high-level discussions. I would want to narrow down to the local levels. So if we talk about this whole conversation around energy transition at high levels, what does it mean to the local communities? What does it mean to about 80 to 85% of Africans that are in the informal sector? So I will be sharing some experience from our project called Innovate for Clean Agricultural Technology. And these are some of the barriers or the bottlenecks we find in our work, and then also be basing on some of the output from our annual report we put out on stranded assets. So basically, there's one key issue we need to understand. There are a lot of social, political, and then cultural push or barriers to this whole energy transition conversation or even green technologies. So for example, we had an innovation challenge with our project. We had some funds. That is quite a good fund that we advertised severally to informal sector and small businesses to be able to apply to this fund and access this fund and use it to upgrade their technology, their green technologies that they have been, these entrepreneurs have been developing. And it was surprising that in Senegal, after doing the adverts, going to various forums and then going to the length of even using the social media to advertise for a call for innovation prize, the whole country only received 27 applicants. We gave more chance, another 1 month to do another round of calls, and we still receive very few applicants. In the same way, in Senegal, in Cote d'Ivoire, we had only 18 applicants, and then in Ghana we had about 80. What am I saying by these numbers? What I mean is that we try to find out why there are not a lot of calls, there are not a lot of entrepreneurs interested in our fund, this green fund. You realize there are a lot of them are uninformed about this whole conversation around transition and green technology. So you contact people who you went to do baseline, and they now tell you, well, I saw your call, but I don't know how it is possible for me to power my agricultural technology or my agro-processing machine with a renewable energy. I think it is not possible because it uses diesel powered engines. So it is not possible to power with renewable energy. So that is why I didn't apply for the fund. So you realize that there's a lot of information or people are not aware about how even green technologies work. So there will be that bottleneck or push in terms of penetration. So the other issues have to do with economic and social and even cultural barriers. For example, when it comes to Ghana, Ghana have now passed out a law, which is
Ferdinand, keep it short, please, just 30 seconds.
Okay, so some of the issues have to do with cultural issues. When you have green, we talk about the cook stove industry or the cooking industry. People are used to using their traditional stoves that give some peculiar taste to their food, and they can't be sure if you are telling them to adopt a solar cooker or electric cooker. Culturally, it doesn't work for them. And then we also talk about issues around green mineral, the excitement around green minerals. For example, in Ghana, you have lithium that have been discovered in large quantities. There is a lot of push back on this because the civil society and then the countrymen think that it's going to be the same thing they have experienced with other minerals without a proper benefit for local communities and other things. So in short, what I want to say is that if we are talking about the green transition without considering a huge number of the informal sector to understand this and follow up with us, then we'll be missing out. It must take a 360 approach, an approach that looks at justice, that looks at equity, that looks at affordability, and then that looks at user friendliness of this technology. We would not be able to make it by bringing the informal sector along. Thank you, over.
Thank you so much, Ferdinand. Thank you all for your useful contributions. Now I open the floor for question and for questions. Please keep your questions and comments short as much as possible. Maybe I take a couple of questions from the hall here and then a couple more from online. Yes, please. And say who you are as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Shankland. I'm a researcher in the Current Popular Politics cluster here at IDS, and we're working on just transitions and energy struggles. So I was listening with great interest to this fantastic set of presentations. Thank you very much. Okay, how to keep the question short. Okay, we've worked mainly on countries that are significant exporters of fossil fuels. And I wanted to come back. First of all, I wanted to thank particularly Yacob and Ferdinand for taking us to the demand side, to the downstream, the user dynamic, because a lot of our research has highlighted the importance of a growing sense of political mobilization around energy rights and around being unjustly deprived of access to energy and around the cost and affordability of energy, which is an issue in the north, as we've seen with the Gilets jaunes in France and here in the UK. So factoring that in to the dynamics, I think is really important. But I wanted to ask about, going back to Mehdi's framing, from below and from above, have the panelists identified, the Uruguay example is wonderful, but Uruguay isn't a major fossil fuel exporter, it's an importer, right? So in countries which get a significant proportion of their revenue from fossil fuel exports, where the incentive, as was correctly pointed out for the elite, is to capture rents, and the incentive for local people is to avoid livelihood damage, and as we've heard so eloquently, green, whether it's in mineral extraction, whether it's in energy production, green transition, reproducing extractive colonial patterns that we've seen so many times before. If the incentive for resistance from below is to avoid that, and the incentive from above is to retain the rents, have any of you come across win-win negotiations in which, for example, by broadening access to energy at the local level, and as you've talked about, as Wei was saying, the way in which programs are implemented, can you give us some hope that this very intractable political economy constellation around incentives to resist from below and from above can be overcome in countries that are major energy exporters? Thank you.
Thank you so much. James, maybe we have 1 or 2 questions online.
I might say them both and then panelists can choose. So interest of time. So Joanna Greenman has asked, actually it's a question for Wei, but others might have a view whether, Wei mentioned the fact that there is in some developing countries, green transition is not necessarily seen as a priority, or they're simply not ready. But does the panel think that climate change effects on things like rainfall patterns may begin to become a push for the diversification of renewable energy? And Adrian Smith asks, what does the panel think about policy priorities in the Global South in respect to very energy-hungry artificial intelligence technologies? How can international technology governance step up to the challenge of anticipating and directing these new technologies?
Perfect. I even know who to guide these questions to. Yacob, if you could take the question on rent extraction, and Wei on Joanna's question on I think it's to do something to do with rainfall and and Frangton on the governance aspect, the last part, please. Yacob. we are rushing in the interest of time. Sorry.
Well, thank you for that question. I think we're always stuck, when it comes to real examples of that. I mean, one that may surprise you. It may come as a potential candidate, of a country that has, or a place that has diversified out of fossil fuel, could be Dubai. The city of Dubai. It's interesting. I mean, of course, that the UAE is broken up into 7 kingdoms and so on. And Dubai is one of those places which didn't have that much oil. And one of the things that they did, as they saw their oil was running out, so maybe the incentives are quite different then. They began to explore, different types of opportunities, whether one agrees with them or not. But at least, it's an interesting model to try and study what that required in terms of building the type of industries and hubs and transport hubs and so forth, and what went into that kind of policy thinking would be quite interesting. And I wouldn't discount also South Africa, because I mean, South Africa did embrace the JET-P agenda quite openly, assuming that there was going to be not sufficient resources that would flow for it to be able to engage with its with its transition. But I'm not sure, as it turned out, when the coffers opened up, there wasn't very much in it. We're talking about 96% of it is private money that has to be somehow generated from somewhere. So the public money was quite limited. So I think if available, there are countries that are ready. The only thing is that the resources are not there for them to be able to go further.
Thank you so much. Wei.
Very quickly answer the questions about the argument that, for the least developed countries, it is not necessary for them to take on clean energy transition. I think the argument is questionable but I think we still need to develop a proper competing narratives on this. But one of the justification, as Yacob mentioned, is that we need to frame this issue not just for climate, but for their development. And we need to justify that, the clean energy transition is not for climate purposes, but still for these countries, additional power supply and more flexible power supply within the distributed system or within a more flexible connection with the existing grid system is in their benefits. All right, and also the narratives that there are some arguments like, these countries may face severe climate-related disasters and so on. That may not justify their takes on mitigation, but development needs for these countries are always a kind of a proper drive for them to take on clean energy transition.
Wonderful, thank you.
I think the momentum is already there in most of these African countries, particularly thinking about the policy frameworks. But of course, there are still some issues, particularly around sectoral specificities. So for instance, if you're looking at solar or if you're looking at wind, geothermal, there could still be issues around them, but it's kind of aggregate level. There are some policy frameworks in place already.
Okay, Yacob, you are insisting to have 30 more seconds.
It's
Just, I mean, it's 30 seconds only.
no more.
Okay.
I think,
thank
you know, one thing that I find frustrating whenever I'm an energy person, when I talk about energy, almost always the discussion goes to finance. Yeah. But that's a particular type of finance. So I think, you know, it would be interesting to try and open up the whole discussion around climate reparations and global taxation, around, you know, infrastructure, the future of infrastructure and so forth. Of course, domestic finances. This is the big topic that we are avoiding in our conversations around finance.
15 seconds.
About AI and so on. And interestingly, when I interviewed some Chinese investors last year, they all mentioned about building data centers in Africa and then providing power for it.
Ethiopia.
Yeah, in many other countries. And this is not just a part of the about data center, but they also talk about, you know, developing industrial parks, developing processing facilities for the minerals, so that they can add on electricity infrastructures to it. I think this kind of a clustered ideas, financing these clustered activities, and how renewable energy investment should be part of the pictures for a group of projects, including transportation, industrial production, whatever data center. It's a new landscape that we are facing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I sincerely apologize. We are not able to take many questions. But no doubt that clean energy transition is necessary, as it reduces greenhouse gas emission and mitigates the effects of climate change. And we need to start. I mean, it's not enough to converse with the converted or the willing partners alone. We need to start understanding the opposition around this topic as well. So a series of similar events are likely to happen. Join us in the future. But today, I'm going to end this conversation by thanking all the speakers, the panelists here, the discussants, and more importantly, you guys, the audience here and as well as online. Also, thank you to Poppy Bradwell and James Georgialakis, the director of Knowledge Translation and Communications program here at IDS, and IDRC for supporting this program. And thank you all. Look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much. Bye for now.